My name is Grant Strachan. I'm a partner in the commercial services team at Brody's. My practice area is focused on product regulation across multiple industry sectors, but particularly within the food and drink sector. I'm joined today by Chris Stanley, the technical director at Anthesis. Now, Chris leads on sustainability, strategy, and sustainable supply chain management. He works with clients to define and address sustainability risks and opportunities in their businesses and products, including how to ensure green claims are robust and supported by evidence. I'm also joined by Emma Hampsey, a senior consultant also at Anthesis. Emma works closely with clients to build internal governance processes for making green claims, conducts claims assessments, and also has international regulatory expertise. If we move on to the next slide and just to set the scene. So as the UK looks to transition to a low carbon economy and consumers become more environmentally conscious in their marketplace, there's a growing incentive for businesses to accentuate the purported green credentials of their products. Now today, we'll be discussing the regulatory boundaries of environmental claims that can be presented in products that are marketed to consumers. In particular, we'll be discussing the regulatory framework governing environmental claims in the UK. We'll look at what does the CAP code permit in relation to environmental claims. We'll also look at the enforcement climate in light of recent environmental claims. We'll also look at recent ASA guidance, in particular what is meant by full life cycle analysis and indeed what type of documentation advertisers and marketers need to exhibit. And we will also consider the latest guidance that indeed was hot off the press. It was published yesterday from the ASA relating to green disposal claims. So first of all, and to set the scene, if we look to the next slide of what a green claim is, well, fundamentally, a green claim is a claim to suggest a product, a service, a brand, or business is either good for the environment or less environmentally damaging than competing goods or services. Contrast a green claim versus greenwashing. Greenwashing ultimately is a form of deceptive marketing in which an organization makes false or misleading claims about the environmental benefits of its products, services, or business practices. Greenwashing can commonly include exaggerating, embellishing, or omitting details in their environmental claims relating to products that are marketed to consumers. That is often achieved by using generic or unsupported claims. Now, the motivation behind making green claims is ultimately commercially driven. It may include attracting investors, in particular green investors, or securing green subsidies, appeasing shareholder concerns, improving the public perception of a company, and of course, a primary driver for certain products may simply be driving sales by creating a more favourable public perception of a company's product, composition, and/or manufacturing processes. For instance, according to a joint study by the IBM and the National Retail Federation, it was reported that 57% of all consumers are willing to change their purchasing habits to reduce their negative environmental impact. So clearly, there's a financial incentive for businesses to market products as environmentally friendly, and it is important that those businesses do not take advantage of this by making fraudulent or indeed misleading claims. Moving on then to the role of the regulator in governing environmental claims. Well, green claims have attracted heightened regulatory scrutiny over the past few years. Indeed, a recent study has shown that 40% of websites were found to deploy potentially misleading environmental tactics. So regulators are clearly more concerned than ever to ensure the accuracy and fairness of environmental or green claims that are made in advertising so that consumers can make properly informed choices. Again, this was supported by a recent European Commission study in which it was found that 53% of environmental claims were used to advertise products, 53% of environmental claims used to advertise products in the EU were misleading or unfounded. So in the UK, this area is regulated by the parallel and overlapping regimes of the Competition Markets Authority and the Advertising Standards Authority. If we can move on to the next slide, please, on the role of the CMA the role of the CMA and the ASA in regulating environmental claims. Now, the CMA is the agency that's responsible for the enforcement of UK consumer protection legislation, such as the Consumer Protection from Unfair Trading Regs of 2008 and the Consumer Rights Act of 2015. It's also important to note that right now, the CMA is currently finalising, we believe, its report into the FMCG sector. The CMA announced in January this year that it was investigating misleading green claims in the fast-moving consumer goods sector, and we expect that report imminently. In terms of the ASA is the self-regulatory body in the UK that regulates advertising through the non-binding code of non-broadcast advertising, sales, promotion, and direct marketing, helpfully abbreviated to the CAP code, and the code of broadcast advertising, the BCAP code, which we will collectively refer to as the codes in this session. Now, on the next slide, we're just looking and summarising some of the recent ASA enforcement and sanctions frameworks. So complaints are ultimately accepted from both the public and industry. There is no de minimis standard, so a single complaint could activate an investigation from the ASA. Now, if a complaint is upheld, but the advertiser doesn't amend or withdraw its advert, then the case is referred to the ASA for enforcement. Now, as I mentioned, the assessment of infringement is not a quantitative assessment, but the ASA will consider the general impact on the particular audience. Indeed, has there been serious or widespread offence? So the enforcement of the codes is undertaken by the ASA. The codes do not create legally binding obligations, and therefore the ASA does not have competence to compel an advertiser to comply with its requests, such as to withdraw or amend an offending advert. However, there are a range of sanctions that the ASA can apply to those who fail to comply with the codes. And we've listed some of those in these sub-bullets here, which fundamentally do serve as an active deterrent against code non-compliance. For example, the withdrawal of trading privileges, the refusal of advertising space, negative publicity, and indeed in the case of persistent breaches or serious breaches, the possibility of the ASA making a referral to enforcement agencies such as trading standards. Now, the core principles, which we discuss on the next slide, of the CAP and BCAP codes, are ultimately framed to ensure that adverts are legal, decent, honest, and truthful, and ultimately do not mislead, cause harm, or cause serious or widespread offence. The overriding principle of the CAP code is set out in Rule 1 is that adverts should not mislead or cause serious or widespread offence. Any claims need to be supported with evidence. Any adverts also need to be responsible. Now, I mentioned earlier that there's a degree of overlap between the CMA and the ASA. In relation to green claims, the CMA updated and published the Green Code in 2021 that ultimately encapsulates most of the CAP code principles. And the list of 6 core principles that were published include the requirement that claims must be truthful and accurate. Claims must avoid being unclear or ambiguous. In particular, claims must not omit or hide any important information that ultimately could lead to consumers making a purchasing decision that they otherwise would not have made. Any comparisons need to be in clear, up-to-date, and objective information. And when making a claim, companies also need to consider the full life cycle of a product or service. And on that, I will come to a little bit more detail shortly. Finally, claims also need to be substantiated so that it can be tested against scientific and other evidence. Now, there's clearly a strong financial incentive for business to market products as environmentally friendly. The ASA applies a very robust and careful scrutiny of environmental claims. First of all, environmental claims must be clear, not misleading, which was referenced earlier. Any absolute claims, so for example, a claim such as a product is 100% recyclable, would require a very high degree of substantiation, whereas relative claims can be justified by demonstrating that one product has a total environmental benefit compared to another. A claim cannot be presented as universally accepted if there's significantly divided opinion, and also there's misleading, and the ASA will uphold a complaint as misleading if a claim is not unique or noteworthy within the industry. I just want to move on to looking at a couple of recent rulings. Now, the ASA publishes rulings every Wednesday morning. Now, on environmental claims, there have been a lot of rulings of late, in particular in relation to certain food and drink products, and indeed on the recyclability or otherwise of those products. I'm just going to cover a couple of rulings that are relevant, not just to food and drink, but also to companies that are involved in the packaging of products to consumers. So in the Pepsi Lipton ruling, this ultimately centered on the claim that a bottle was made of 100% recycled material. That statement was then caveated with a small asterisk denoting smaller text at the bottom of the product label. Now, the accompanying text stated that the claim, the 100% recycled claim, only applied to the bottle, but excluded the cap and the label. Now, that triggered a complaint, and the ASA upheld the complaint on the basis that consumers would understand the claim as referencing the entire product was made of 100% recycled material. This just reinforces the principle that the ASA is concerned at evaluating the overall impression created by a product. And in this ruling, the asterisk qualification was insufficient to counter that impression. So claims wording was ultimately held to be misleading and in breach of the cap code. Now, a very similar ruling was in the Aqua Pura case, but the complaint was upheld not on the basis of substantiation, but rather due to the exaggeration of environmental properties. Now, 4 claims were taken into consideration here. A claim related to a product being made of 100% recycled materials, so similar to the Pepsi Lipton case, 100% recyclable bottle, as well as an eco-friendly cap, and then the statement that is nature-friendly. Now, unlike in the Pepsi Lipton case, the Aqua Pura was actually able to demonstrate that all of the components of the product were capable of being recycled. And so the claim that 100% of the product was recyclable was allowed. However, the eco-friendly cap statement was held to be ambiguous, as it suggested an additional environmental benefit was provided by the cap. Also, the claim nature-friendly was also held to be an absolute claim, requiring substantiated evidence to show the full life cycle of the products as holding a positive impact on the environment. Moving on to a couple of other cases we found interesting here, and moving aside from the food and drink sector, this was a recent ruling, tier operations, involving an electric scooter. The claim included the words "be environmentally friendly," and that was held to be misleading. The advertiser tried to argue that there was an implicit comparative claim and provided evidence to show that the scooter had less of a negative impact on the environment than alternative methods of transport. However, it wasn't able to demonstrate that it caused no environmental damage at all. Now, this is particularly interesting in the context of electric transport. Clearly, there's a lot of not just e-scooters, but e-bike and electric vehicles out there that have had a huge surge in popularity and sales over the last five-year period. Now, the fact that the ASA is holding out a ruling that the statement "be environmentally friendly" needs to showcase the full life cycle, and that the product needs to demonstrate that it has some environmental impact, will be upheld. Because ultimately, if a manufacturer is saying that a product caused no environmental damage at all, they would need to provide substantiated evidence to showcase that. So the complaint was upheld here on the basis that the claim was likely to be understood as an absolute claim, suggesting that the scooter caused no environmental damage over its lifetime. Another ruling which was slightly controversial and has generated quite a lot of discussion was the HSBC ruling in October 2022. Now, this centered on the omission of significant information. Complaints were upheld and related to 2 posters published by the bank that failed to disclose significant details about the bank's greenhouse gas emissions. Now, the ads referenced HSBC's commitment to transition to net zero, and stated, amongst other text, that the bank was helping to plant 2 million trees, which would lock in 1.25 million tons of carbon over their lifespan. Now, in this instance, the complaint was actually upheld on the basis that the ads were misleading because they failed to reference that HSBC as a business also supported companies and enterprises with significant greenhouse gas emissions. So um, the ruling really underscored the emissions produced by businesses financed by bank investments. The ASA also highlighted that the imagery of the natural world accompanying those claims contributed to the impression that the ad was genuinely making a significant contribution to reducing greenhouse gas emissions. So if we recap and round up on a couple of those recent rulings, and what do they tell us? Well, first of all, advertisers must be able to show that there's suitable evidence to show that a product is recyclable. Absolute claims, such as 100% environmentally friendly or totally recyclable for zero environmental legacy, must be capable of substantiation. And that is actually taken from supplementary rulings and more historic rulings as well. The basis of any environmental claims must be clear. And indeed, unqualified claims could mislead if they omit significant information. That's not just the HSBC ruling, but also an established principle that we've seen in the oat milk case of Alpro from 2021. Businesses must not exaggerate the environmental credentials of their product, for example, by implying that all of a product can be recycled if only part of it can be. Indeed, if the claim is intended to cover the entire product and its life cycle or specific components are only recyclable, then that needs to be made clear. So moving on to an analysis and some enforcement trends that we can pick up here. Well, I think it's clear to say that any adverts for products which contain recycled and non-recycled materials must ensure that there's a clear distinction between which elements are recycled and which are not. Any qualification of a claim in particular must be clearly stated and must be obvious to the consumer. Also, consideration needs to be given not only to the placement, font, and size of the statement, but also the overall impression of an advert. And finally, businesses must not overstate the environmental impact of an advert. I'd like to move on just to round up on some recent ASA guidance. The first goes back to, or the first is from summer this year, in June 2023. The ASA updated its guidance in relation to full life cycle substantiation. Now, this concept of full life cycle really refers to all stages of a product development, i.e. from manufacturing to the eventual disposal of a product. Now, it's already established in the CAP code that advertisers must base environmental claims on the full life cycle of the product. And indeed, general environmental claims are likely to be interpreted as a claim about the product's entire life cycle. So in this guidance, which is a very helpful and comprehensive document, it lists some examples of claims that would require full life cycle analysis. So for example, a claim that a product is good for the planet, that a product is environmentally friendly, contains less plastic, has zero emissions, or is good for the land, or indeed is helping to support a more sustainable future. All of those statements would ultimately require a full life cycle analysis from the manufacturer producer. Moving on then to something even more recent, the ASA yesterday on the 28th of November brought out a report that was based on consumer feedback. So the ASA had instructed some consumer analysis relating to disposal claims, in particular consumer understanding of certain terms such as biodegradable, compostable, recycled, and recyclable. Now, ultimately, what this report shows is that there's a very wide variation in terms of both consumer understanding as well as consumer attitudes towards each of those statements. So I'm not going to run through the definition of each of those terms, but there is a subtle but important difference between biodegradable, compostable, and compostable in particular. So, for example, biodegradable is something that can be broken down and reabsorbed by nature. What's important to take from this is that there's no definition of the breakdown timeline. So, for example, a coffee cup that takes 30 years to break down and an apple that takes a month can both be described as such. I think one of the things that was particularly noteworthy from this report is that when the ASA explained this to consumers or put this into the questionnaire, there was there was quite significant reaction from the audience, and there was several people surveyed expressed an anger and frustration that they felt that some of the claims made by marketers was particularly misleading in that regard. Again, the next slide just shows the variation between the between the different statements that can be made. Again, I'm not going to spend much time going through each of those different definitions, but ultimately what the survey shows us, what the ASA's report tells us, is that there's a stronger and higher level of understanding on claims relating to recycled or recyclable content, whereas consumers are clearly less aware and should less of an understanding in relation to the distinction between biodegradable and compostable. So to wrap this up, and a couple of takeaways that I just want to emphasize, and a few points to consider before making environmental claims. So first of all, stay factual and be mindful of evolving scientific opinion. Make sure that environmental claims are truthful and not misleading. Do not exaggerate or treat opinion like fact. Ensure that environmental claims are based on up-to-date information, and make sure that be careful rather if basing claims on new developments where there is no scientific consensus. On substantiation, marketers may be called upon by the ASA to prove that a claim is true. Marketers should also keep documentary evidence to back this up, and where appropriate, obtain independent verification. For example, a company that sets a goal to reduce the carbon footprint of its products would also need to implement a carbon accounting system to track and manage those emissions related to those products. Tread carefully when making absolute claims. It is clearly much harder to substantiate an absolute claim, such as environmentally friendly, than it is to substantiate a relative claim, such as environmentally friendlier than the previous version or the old formula, etc. Be careful of making comparative claims. So the CAP code requires comparisons with identifiable competitor products, and these must objectively compare one or more material, relevant, verifiable, and representative features of those products. So, for example, words such as greener or friendlier will require verifiable evidence that proves an environmental benefit over comparable products. And finally, marketers should err on the side of caution. So anyone can complain about an advert to the ASA for free. As I mentioned earlier, there is no qualitative baseline here. So ultimately, it's easy for an accessible tool for environmental campaigners to take action and raise complaints. And so ultimately, companies need to be very careful and be ready to substantiate any claims that they are making. And on that point, I'm going to hand over to Chris and Emma, who are going to discuss in a bit more detail what Anthesis does, and also the ways in which they help clients to evidence and substantiate their product claims. Chris, over to you.
Thanks, Grant. Yeah, that's good. Just so those of you who may not have heard of Anthesis, we're a global sustainability advisory firm, probably the largest dedicated group in the world, and you can see some of our global clients. So we also work obviously with a lot smaller clients. We have an office in Edinburgh. There's about 10 of us based there, and we work with a lot of clients on this whole topic of what can they say about their products and indeed about their own company and brand that makes sure that it doesn't result in greenwashing appearances or indeed fall foul of those regulations that Grant has been talking through in the last few minutes. Okay, next slide, please. So Grant's gone through some of the things that are covered in the ASA guidance. The Competition and Markets Authority has much aligned their guidance to that. And if you look at guidance that's published in other parts of the world, particularly in the US with the FTC Green Guide and in the EU current green claims requirements, they have a pretty similar set of common requirements. So, you know, it really means that you've got to meet these requirements both in the UK and in other parts of the world. And particularly, we would emphasize the need to consider the full life cycle of the product because that's where you can demonstrate your product it has some benefits from an environmental point of view, and that has to be substantiated. And without substantiation, you will fall foul of these regulations and this guidance, and really avoid using generic terms. Now that's going to become a lot tighter. And I dare say that Brody's might want to run another session once the EU Green Claims Directive, which is currently about to be finalised, when that's published, it actually, according to the draft versions, will be a lot tighter and will make it even more difficult to make claims without the right level of evidence and without actually using and prevent you from using very common terms that are currently used on products. So it will become more onerous in Europe. We believe effectively the UK is aligned with those EU standards, so you can expect a tightening in due course from the CMA and the SA, I believe, over the next couple of years as well. So next slide, please. So we work with clients over a typical journey, and the sorts of clients we've been working with have been in the retail space, in the food and drink, consumer product space, but also in non-consumer facing businesses. So while they may not be caught by some of the consumer legislation, they are caught by legislation and guidance that relates to business transactions as well. And in every case, we established a fairly standard process, because without it, you still stand the risk of putting claims out there which fall foul of the regulations or will leave you open to attack about greenwashing. So I think the first point on this journey is about having a governance framework. And in many companies, particularly if you're making food and drink or health and beauty products or whatever, maybe it's your commercial teams have come up with a new product idea, or a supplier is offering you a product and they want to make claims about that product. And quite often those products can get out in the marketplace without enough checks and balances. So what we tend to do with our clients is work out a governance framework with clear roles and responsibilities, which means it's signed off at every stage of new product development before it reaches the market. Or indeed, a claim that maybe appears on your website or social media is also checked before it gets out there. And just by doing that process with our clients, we find that it starts to engage people across the organization who perhaps never thought about the implications of making a green claim, which would not be allowed, or which might be perceived as greenwashing. So it's very important to start to think about the process and get that framework starting to develop. We also review existing claims against the guidelines and regulations. So we've done this for some very large companies recently, and they've had to withdraw quite a lot of claims that they had out there, because once we pointed out either they were using language which couldn't be supported, or referred to the claim sort of implied it was it applied to the whole life cycle of the product and it only applied to a small part of it, etc. So it's that sort of advice that's really important to companies now, to make sure you're on the right footing going forward. And in order to do that, we also map your product's impacts over their life cycle, because clearly, depending on what type of product you make, the impacts it's going to have could be very different. If, for example, you're making a shampoo product, then there's clearly some impacts in the materials that you're using in your product formula, and maybe a bit in the packaging as well. But actually, the biggest impact from using a shampoo is in the energy used to heat the shower when you actually use the shampoo. And that's not always seen, but big companies who make shampoos and similar products understand this. So they've been addressing how to help consumers reduce the amount of energy they use in their shower, for example. The same would apply to washing detergents for washing machines, where companies like Unilever and Procter & Gamble have been really encouraging people to use lower temperature to wash their clothes in, and that reduces energy consumption, reduces the impact. So actually, the impact of the life cycle could be during use, or even at the end of life of the product. So you need to understand where that is. You need to understand what the impacts might be, because they could be energy and carbon emissions, but it could be about water consumption. It could be impact on biodiversity. And we also look at things that could impact on the social aspects over the supply chain. So it could be to do with workers' rights, etc. And of course, there are various certifications out there like fair trade, which look at areas like the social impacts. So you have to take a holistic approach to your product's life cycle. Where are the biggest impacts? Make sure you understand where they are, and make sure that any claim you make really addresses one of those material impacts, one of the most important impacts, not do something that's fairly spurious. So again, take my shampoo example. If you had a shampoo perhaps in a bottle which is then in a carton, and the carton says it's eco-friendly carton, FSC certified, well, that's very nice, but it's really not material and important to the whole product. We also advise developing a product scorecard system to track claims risks and the evidence needed to support the claims. So make sure that you've got a very systemized approach to look at how risky that claim might be. And I'll talk about that in a minute on that. And then clearly establish which certifications and standards out there can best support your claims. Now, all the guidelines and regulations are driving towards approved certifications. I mentioned fair trade is one that's well regarded. FSC is also well regarded, but there are many others which are well regarded, like EU's own eco label. But there are also a lot of eco labels out there. We reference about 500 or so out there, which are not really worth the paper they're written on. In other words, they don't really get to the heart of a particular claim, or they don't have a very good approval rating from external stakeholders. They don't have a proper auditing system in place, etc. So we have looked at a lot of these, and I'll talk about that again in a minute. And finally, having got that foundation, you need to make sure any messaging that you put on products aligns with your corporate strategy, and that should align indeed with your corporate brand positioning as well. And that's a whole other story. We've been talking primarily about product claims here, but in fact, of course, the ASA guideline also comes into what you say about your company as well. And the EU, for example, is going to potentially say that you can't make an environmental claim about a product or service that you offer if your whole business is about is a business that harms the environment. They're obviously specifically thinking about oil and gas companies here, but if that gets actually approved and adopted, that can have wide-reaching consequences. Also, you need to support any suppliers you have to adopt your claims. So you may need to get them to do a lot of work, make sure that they're developing new products and materials that support your claims and are collaborating on this journey. And last but not least, as we found with many clients, certain people in the organization will understand the importance of green claims, but many will not. And everybody needs to get up to the same standard and level of understanding and work to the governance framework that's been developed. So that's an overview. Next slide, please. And we get right into the detail when we're working with our clients on their products. And the life cycle analysis, can be very complex process. We can do the full life cycle analysis, which looks at a whole range of different inputs and outputs, the product over its life cycle. But we can also do that in a more simplified way, one that still stands up to scrutiny and can be more automated. And companies like Reckitt, Benkiza, PepsiCo, and one or two others use our tools to actually look at any new product developments, if they're changing formulation or packaging, or if they're bringing out a new product, they can use a system that enables them to look at the impacts of that product and how it's changed, and essentially have a dashboard that helps the commercial people, the marketing people, and the technical people to launch products which are more sustainable than the previous ones. So there are a lot of tools and techniques out there. I won't go into the details of that, but there is a lot of capability. The EU directive in particular will be looking for more detailed and robust evidence for claims. So it's inevitable that more and more companies are going to have to do this level of detail. But the good news is the big companies are already doing this, and they're providing guidance and help to a lot of their suppliers as well. Next slide, please. So we assess product claims by looking at what is the claim about, what's its characteristic, and how does it relate to the overall impact of the product, and is it a replacement for a commonly used standard practice in the industry? Does it actually demonstrate environmental improvements versus the industry standard? And we then have a risk rating, and it starts off as a relatively straightforward risk rating, which helps then to guide whether your claim is going to meet the requirements of the legislation. So look at the characteristic, look then at the evidence that's available. Is it certifiable? Is it independent? Is it credible? And then the terminology used, and does that terminology meet the core requirements in the various guidelines and regulations? And is it truthful, accurate, doesn't omit relevant information, etc. So we will look at all claims, product claims, and assess them against this risk framework. And that usually, when the first time we do that with companies, they get a bit of a shock. They realize that some of the claims they've been using just really shouldn't be used at too high risk. And some of the companies we've been working with, RS Group's a huge electrical and mechanical wholesaler, distributor. Holland & Barrett, you'll know, as a chain of high street stores. Adobe, which is obviously a software services company, and ASOS, which of course is an online clothing retailer. All of these have had their claims evaluated. Next slide, please. And another company we've been working with is Amazon. And some of you may have come across the Climate Pledge Friendly program that they have. They advertise, well, they're rather trying to signpost to their customers more sustainable products. And what we've done is make sure that any product that they signpost under this Climate Pledge Friendly banner is a product that's approved to a certification, to a standard, one that we've evaluated and say is appropriate to that type of product. So we've done a review of hundreds of different standard certifications. And as I said before, some of these are good, some of these not so good. And it's very important, if you can get your product certified, that's the best way of making sure that you're going to meet the claims, regulations, and standards. I think that's my last slide, I think. Is there another one? Right, that's it. So as a quick scamper through, I'm available, and Emma, who leads a lot of these projects, is also available for our Q&A. But I'll hand back to Grant to lead that.
Thank you, Chris. That was really, really helpful, and a nice compliment to hopefully the more sort of mundane legal weeds of our presentation when we ran through the intricacies of ASA and CMA enforcement. So it was really helpful to understand a bit more detail on the life cycle analysis and substantiation requirements. The floor is open to questions. I think we have one question which is asking, how can companies enhance their brand through making environmental and green claims? I think I can lead on that, Chris, and feel free to chip in. I think the one we've obviously run through a lot of the sensitivities and issues that marketers and producers need to consider to ensure they stay on the right lines. And I think the other thing I would add to that, and there's a really good example that jumps out recently in terms of businesses taking a bit more of a creative approach towards sustainability targets. So, for example, Unilever, the FMCG producer that has dozens, if not hundreds, of brands, also holds reformulation patents for its refrigerator products. Now, Unilever waived its patent rights recently on those on those refrigerator products, and what that essentially allows is those patents basically allows the temperature on freezers to be increased by 6 degrees. Now, that is estimated that produces an energy reduction of approximately 25% per freezer cabinet, which is clearly not only better for the environment, but also reduces the costs and the running costs in those freezers. Now, I read an interesting news article that reported on this, and Unilever has said that the emissions from retail ice cream freezers account for approximately 10% of its value chain greenhouse gas footprint. And with Unilever reportedly owning and loaning and maintaining approximately 3 million ice cream freezers around the world, this reduction in energy across its freezers clearly could have a significant impact for its internal operations. But more than that, it's clearly is also a very good marketing tool for the business, because they're able to showcase not only their technology portfolio, but their commitment towards maintaining and sharing ESG commitments, and a commitment towards reducing their greenhouse gas and environmental footprint. So I think that's a really good example that struck me of just a way in which businesses are creating a bit more of a, or taking a commercial approach, but also a creative approach towards their environmental and sustainability goals. Chris, was there anything that you
Yeah,
wanted to
well,
add to
just to build on
the
it, it is
question?
quite tricky to position yourself correctly as a brand or a company without appearing to greenwash. And we know a lot of examples of companies that have been doing that, that actually, really do look like they're greenwashing. And I won't name names, but it's less clear how you will be affected by regulations on that. Certainly your reputation will be affected if it's pointed out that this is not consistent. But having said that, the Advertising Standards Authority in their webinar yesterday, which I listened to, they said, we don't want to discourage people from making claims about their products, or indeed discourage firms from promoting what they're doing. But they need to do it in a very clear and transparent way, and be very honest. I mean, that's what it's really about. It's honesty and authenticity. Being honest about where you're doing some good stuff, but also being honest where you're not, and what you're trying to still work on. And provided you take that approach, then you're not trying to fool anybody, then I think it's all fine. But it is a tricky line, and we are struggling with that with some of our clients at the moment, trying to find a way of making sure that they're not saying something that presents them in a more favourable light as a business than they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yes, absolutely. We've got another question here, which I think touches on some of the issues that you covered, Chris, in terms of supply chains and the life cycle analysis, or in supply chains. And the question is, how can businesses ensure transparency throughout supply chains, especially where there's a complex and global supply chain?
Yeah, it's very difficult. Obviously, many companies are buying commodities that may be traded, and therefore you don't know where they're coming from. More and more, you're trying to work out ways of identifying where those materials have come from in the first place. That is complex. It is quite hard to do, and the biggest companies are struggling with that, as smaller companies are. I think what you're really looking for is some, again, certifications, evidence that the original material has been prepared in the right way, in an environmentally friendly way, and indeed a socially friendly way, and that you've got a chain of custody, as it's called. In other words, you can trace that material right through to the materials that you're getting into your own operation. Now it's easier said than done with a lot. So we see commodities like palm oil. There's what they call RSPO, which is an attempt to try and demonstrate the transparency of certain palm oil, so it doesn't come from deforested areas. The EU's own deforestation directive, which is now in force, also requires you to demonstrate that you're not having an impact on actually causing deforestation. So that means there's a lot of companies working on this together. And I think it's all about collaboration. It's about learning from each other and joining in with companies who are taking a lead on this, and who will be the Unilevers and the Procter & Gamble's, the Tesco's and the Nestle's of this world.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen collaboration action through the Unilever example that discussed a moment ago. So I think I would just add to that as well, Chris, on as a lawyer, and without getting into the weeds of this, but I think clearly commercial contracting and the agreements that companies enter into is crucially important here. We're seeing a number of businesses that are looking to the Transfer Lane project, and some commercial clauses that are appearing in agreements as mandatory. So one of the things that we advise companies on, that we're seeing more of, is businesses inserting environmental and ESG related clauses into into contracts as effectively conditions precedent before going into agreements with certain supply chain actors, whether that's downstream suppliers or OEM manufacturers. So I think the commercial agreements are crucial, and as part of that, in terms of the interoperability of supply chains, it is already, and it's going to continue to be something that global businesses or producers with a global audience and global consumer base is really going to need to look at in more detail around how they enter into contracts and what type of policies and procedures they have in place, and indeed their suppliers have in place, that gives assurances around ESG commitments. Because clearly a business could have the most robust and transparent methodologies in place to showcase sustainable claims and practices, but if downstream suppliers are providing products that don't come close to meeting those standards, then it sort of falls away to some extent. So certainly the contracting principles are already imperative and will continue to be so.
Yeah, I've got on that, Grant. We work with lots of companies now. I lead on sustainable procurement supply chain. So this means that you have to engage your suppliers in the right way. Perhaps before you get to any contractual details, you need to make sure that they understand what's required, and indeed support them to understand what's required before you build it into contractual principles. Now, more and more companies are setting their net zero or space targets for emissions reduction, and then requiring their and starting to build that into the contracts. That is now doing that, as I think you've said, Grant. So, but I would still caution that you don't just rush into putting things into your contracts. You really need to engage, and it's all about effectively collaboration in the end, because you can't do it on your own as an end organization.
Yeah, absolutely. Excellent. Okay, well, I think that's the end of the questions that I can see on the screen. But of course, if anyone listening does have any questions, then our contact information for myself, Chris, and Emma are on this last slide. So please do get in touch. And on that note, it's thank you from me for listening, and Chris, thank you very much for your time too.
Thank you very much, and look forward to hearing from anybody who wants to follow up anything. Okay.
Indeed.
Bye now.